Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. In 1972, French adventurer and scientist Michel Siffre famously shut himself in a cave in Texas for more than 6 months, what still clocks in as one of the longest self-isolation experiments in history. He meticulously documented the effects on his mind over those 205 days, and he wrote that he could barely string thoughts together after only a couple of months. By the 5-month mark, he was reportedly so desperate for company that he tried to befriend a mouse, albeit unsuccessfully. Though we may not be as isolated as Michel Siffre was in 1972, I think we're all starting to feel the effects of isolation on our minds. So that gave me the idea to do this episode to learn a little bit about the effect of isolation on our mental health and just our health in general. So that's what we're talking about today. The primary source for this episode is an article from Trends in Cognitive Sciences by Bzbok and Dunbar, 2020, so a very recent one. So a lot of the insights from it were pretty applicable to what we're going through right now, you guys. So first, let's start with why social bonds are good for us. We know we're feeling the effects of isolation. And why is that? Well, it's because we are lacking these social bonds that are good for us. Humans are a naturally social species, and we've evolved in group dynamics for all of our history. It was our social networks, like our families, our tribes, or our communities, that enabled us to survive throughout the years. So this is why social deprivation can cause stress, because it's unnatural for us. And this is what we're experiencing right now. In times of distress, crisis, or disaster, human resilience depends on the richness and strength of social connections, as well as on active engagement in groups and communities. There's now accumulating evidence that friendships are essential for health quality. So there's research that has examined 148 studies, and this totaled 300,000 people in total. And they were looking to identify the common factors that unfortunately led to death. So in the case of death due to cardiovascular disease, the 3 factors with by far the biggest effect were: 1, the frequency of social support from others; 2, how well integrated the person was in their social network; and 3, whether the patient smoked. So we think a lot about smoking as a factor for influencing cardiovascular disease, but we don't think about these other 2 factors that were also judged to be just about as important. And they were the frequency of social support from others and how well integrated the person was in their social network. So social networks keep us alive, essentially. The tighter someone is embedded in a network of friends, the less likely they are to become ill, is what research shows. Also, the more socially connected you are, the faster you get better if you do fall ill, the quicker you recover from surgery, and the longer you will live, is what research has shown. So this is kind of the irony of all of this social isolation, because we are isolating to prevent sickness, but research also shows, funnily enough, that the more socially connected you are, the faster you get better, and there are going to be salubrious health effects the quicker you recover from certain things. So although it is overall beneficial to be isolating right now, if it wasn't beneficial, we wouldn't be doing it. And you see the numbers go down when we do that, but there is that irony there of how it does allow us to be more prone to fall ill if we do perhaps catch the virus or any other type of virus too. We are possibly more prone to get it due to all of this isolation. So there's always 2 sides to every coin. That's what I like about doing these episodes, certainly, is because I as well as you guys hopefully get a little bit of an in-depth look at different things where you may have thought that it was a one-sided thing, but then you see kind of different aspects of each thing. So that's what I'm taking away from this research I did today, certainly, is that there are effects on our health isolating so much too. So it's not perfect, the strategy that we have to keep us safe. what are the effects on our mind? That's something that I've been noticing. Mostly, I tend to mostly think about the effects things have on the mind. I like psychology. I like discussions about these things. So let's talk about that. So isolation is known to be a major risk factor for depression, which itself accelerates functional decline and increases mortality rate. So here we have almost like an indirect link of isolation towards negative health effects, because isolation can lead to depression, then depression can lead to all sorts of different things. So I know a lot of people are struggling with mental health issues with all of this isolation. We all are to a certain extent. Some of us at subclinical levels. So if we were to go into the clinic, maybe it wouldn't be diagnosed as depression, but we still are feeling some effects. And some people at clinical levels where, yes, the depression was brought on by the difficulties happening right now. So, and research does show as well that even subclinical depression can increase risk of mortality. Depression may increase mortality and illness through several mechanisms. So there's extensive research on this, but we can just touch on a couple of these things. Depression can increase platelet aggregation through diminished serotonin function and thereby increase the risk of myocardial infarction and stroke. So it kind of creates like almost like hypertension, and this can increase your risk of stroke. There may also be an increased heart rate variability, so unstable, like an unstable nervous system that leads to this change in heart rate, and that contributes to creating a more variable heart rate. There may also be an increased release of adrenaline, and these things both lead to the increased risk of cardiac arrhythmia. So depression can really mess with your nervous system and the way, and hence the way your heart is pumping blood to the rest of your body, by way of creating an irregular rhythm in your heart. So this is the connection kind of between your mind and your body. And you got to be careful of keeping your mind healthy, because if your mind is not healthy, your body won't be healthy either, and vice versa. Whatever the mechanism, the effect of depression on mortality is significant in size. In a large cohort study done by the Cardiovascular Health Network, investigators found that depression increased mortality risk by 24% when they accounted for all important covariables. And individuals have been found to reduce their depressive symptoms if they join a social group, such as a sports club, church, political party, hobby group, or charity. And the fact that we can't do any of this right now, or maybe we can do some of it if it's through Zoom or whatever, but we'll talk about later in the episode how maybe Zoom and FaceTime and things like this are not quite as good as face-to-face interaction. But just the fact that we're not able to join some of these groups to mitigate the effects of isolation right now, we're in total lockdown, that is troublesome, and that's problematic, and that can lead to depression at varying levels. We talked about how the mind can influence the body. The health of the mind can influence the health of the body. Let's talk about more directly the body itself, the immune system, and how this isolation could be negatively impacting our immune system. And by the way, this is not an episode about how bad it is for these policies of isolation to exist, but it's just the idea that these policies, they do put strain on people. And I really wanted to dive into some of what this strain really is. So researchers found that social bonds stimulate the release of the body's natural killer cells, one of the white blood cells of the innate immune system, whose core function is to destroy harmful bacteria and viruses. So again, it's weakening your immune system when you don't have these social bonds, because these social bonds have been found to stimulate the release of the body's natural killer cells. So the more social connections you have, the better you are at fighting infection. Researchers also found that freshman students who reported feeling lonely had a reduced immune system response when they were given a flu vaccine compared to students who felt like they were socially well engaged. So more and more evidence of these social connections helping your immune system, a connection that you may or I never even really knew existed, but I was thinking about it more in terms of how social isolation is affecting the mind, but look at the way that it's affecting your body directly. In adolescence, lack of social engagement has a big effect on the risk of inflammation and lack of physical activity, in adolescence, lack of social engagement had as big of an effect on risk of inflammation as did lack of physical activity. So we, a lot of the time, think about, physical activity is great. We got to stay active and this and that. But we don't think about, hey, we got to stay socially connected and socially engaged, because social engagement has been found to have just as big as an impact on risk of inflammation as did physical activity. So if you're physically active as an adolescent, that's just as good as being socially engaged, and vice versa. So it's an important thing that we just do not consider. And in old age, it's a similar situation. So lack of friends actually had a bigger effect on risk of hypertension than the usually cited clinical causes, such as diabetes. A lot of the time we think about, what are the impacts that diabetes is going to have? It's going to increase our risk of hypertension in old age. But what about lack of friends? And lack of friends actually was found to have a bigger effect on hypertension than diabetes. So these connections are very valuable for your body itself. Isolation is also associated with disrupted sleep. Insomnia affects immune function, glucose regulation, cardiovascular risk, dementia risk, mood, and daytime function. So when another kind of indirect effect. So when you're isolated, your sleep may get disrupted. And then if your sleep gets disrupted, there's a whole plethora of research on the negative impacts of that. And then you talk about decreased immune function. You can't regulate your blood sugar. You're at risk of stroke. You're at risk of heart disease. You're at risk of dementia. And your mood is going to be variable and all sorts of things. So another kind of indirect effect of, if you notice your sleep is more disturbed now, well, maybe that's partially due to the isolation that we're in. We're not able to form these close connections currently. Let's talk about cardiovascular health, health of the heart. So social isolation can have direct effects on cardiovascular disease factors. Isolation and loneliness are associated with increased sympathetic nervous system activity, increased inflammation, and decreased sleep, all of which can accelerate brain and cardiovascular aging. The sympathetic nervous system, that is like your fight or flight system. So when you're isolated, when you're feeling lonely, it's activating that system almost for no reason. There's no reason to, sympathetic nervous system, it's like the fear side of your nervous system, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is like your rest and relax. So if this fear system is always active, it's not going to be conducive to good health benefits. So, and this is what isolation can do. It can overactivate your sympathetic nervous system. It increases inflammation, and all of these different things can accelerate cardiovascular aging. So your heart is like, you're gaining like an older heart, not a wiser heart, but an older one that doesn't function as well. Loneliness increases risk for dementia, likely through these same mechanisms. And social stimulation, on the other hand, can help maintain brain health. So look at the benefits of social stimulation as opposed to social isolation. Researchers have found increased cholesterol in socially isolated individuals as well. These changes increase risk of heart attacks and stroke. So I'm sorry to just be hitting you guys with all these negative effects of something that we can't really do anything about, but it was more just out of my curiosity to know what are all the impacts of all this isolation, because I'm not feeling 100% myself for a variety of reasons. So I wanted to know those reasons, and hopefully you guys do too, and hopefully this isn't too enlightening on the negative side of it. But we'll kind of continue with the cardiovascular risks of social isolation. So these same researchers noted that these changes in cardiovascular risk factors in isolated individuals were independent of whether they express feelings of loneliness. So this kind of gets at a very interesting distinction here. So even if you are isolated and you think you're doing okay and you don't feel lonely, well, these cardiovascular risks can still be present even if you perhaps feel okay and you don't report feeling lonely. So just being isolated alone is enough to cause all of these things without you consciously feeling, there's something called perceived social isolation. So even if you don't experience that perceived social isolation, the social isolation itself can create all of these risks to your cardiovascular health without you knowing it. Let's talk about the brain. This is what I'm most interested in, and kind of how I was thinking about how the isolation is messing with people's minds, and messing with my mind for sure. In rats, episodes of social isolation can irrevocably alter the function of the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, among many other things, it is central to managing our social relationships. And in rats, episodes of social isolation can also alter axon myelination. The myelin sheath around axons is the coating around them that basically allows them to transmit signals faster and more efficiently. So it is damaging. Social isolation in rats, at least, damages the brain itself. It damages these myelin sheaths, and it alters the function of the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is very necessary for a whole host of things, including planning, like I mentioned, managing our social relationships. Just really managing is what it does. Managing a lot of things in your life, planning your tasks, and then doing different daily things and so on. So when you're damaging or at least altering the function of that area, it's not going to be good. And that's what social isolation has been found to do in rats, at least. So it really does make you wonder if all of this isolation could have a permanent impact on our brains. Granted, this is a study in rats, but could this translate to us? I mean, because you go to the grocery store now, or you go to any place that's even moderately crowded, and don't you feel a little more jumpy? Don't you feel when people get near you, you're more aware of when people kind of get in your space? If you bump into someone, it's almost like you guys are like shocked and frozen, and it does kind of make everything feel a little bit weirder. And maybe this is because our brains are changing, at least slightly, with this lockdown and so on. So persistent loneliness has also been found to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and depression in humans. So this may not be directly connected to what we had mentioned before, where social isolation alone is enough to have negative impacts. Now it's kind of another level of social isolation. Now it's loneliness, perceived, reported loneliness. So if you're really struggling right now mentally and you are feeling lonely, then yes, this can have even worse effects on the brain, and as research shows, can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and depression. Insight into the neurobiology of social isolation has also been derived from rigorous experiments with adult primates. So let's talk about one study in monkeys that has revealed a lot about the neurobiology of social isolation and what is happening to the brain when an individual is isolated, or at least when a monkey individual is isolated. So in one study, 20 monkeys were separated from others to live alone for 1.5 years. And granted, that is quite a long time. And yes, this is a study in monkeys, but that's what research hopes to do. We can't do an experiment like this on humans, so we try to find something that is close and hopefully are able to translate some of the findings to us. So yes, this was a long time, but let's talk about what happened in this study. So these monkeys lived alone for 1.5 years, and the monkeys were then reintegrated into social groups of 4 monkeys housed together. Repeated positron emission tomography, so PET scanning, just a type of brain scanning to reveal activity in the brain, revealed increased levels of dopamine receptors in the basal ganglia, which include key nodes of the reward circuitry after being socially housed. So when the monkeys were in the social groups, that's when they were able to, I guess they weren't able to produce, but this is when their brains did produce more dopamine receptors in the brain. And dopamine is kind of like the happiness chemical. So, or the feel-good chemical. You get it when you eat. You get it when you sleep. You get it when you do things that are conducive to your health and make you happy. You get a lot of it when exercising. Those results are well known. So when you're socially housed, when these monkeys were socially housed in groups, they had more receptors for happiness chemicals. So they're going to experience more positive feelings. This neurochemical adaptation in the monkey's brain circuitry was apparent after as few as 3 months of social rehabilitation in the once isolated monkeys. So the monkeys that were isolated, when they came back in with the group, after 3 months, their brain was able to increase their dopamine receptors, and this better circuitry started to show. So this reintegration kind of it's an insight for what may happen to us. Maybe these changes in our brain won't last forever, these negative changes, because when we get reintegrated into society and everyone's in groups again, maybe we will get more of those dopamine receptors again, and we will start to feel better, and things will get back to normal, starting internally in each of us. After reintegration, previously isolated monkeys spent more time by themselves. Now this is kind of opposite to what I was just saying. So this kind of shows that even if they did get some of their receptors back in their brain, their behavior patterns may still persist even after reintegration. So let's look at us. Maybe when we get reintegrate again, and say you go to a club or a bar, no one has their mask on, because even though everyone's been vaccinated, could you still be afraid? Could you still kind of be off on your own a little bit? Could you be more hesitant to join these big groups? Perhaps your behavior patterns may still be there, even if your brain and your dopamine receptors in your brain have kind of recovered in a way. Socially isolated monkeys were also significantly more willing to self-administer cocaine. And this may also relate to heightened drug abuse in lonely humans. So this is widely known. Look how kind of outcasted individuals or pariahs kind of turn to drugs when they don't have access to other ways of feeling good. For example, social connections. So you can even think back to the liquor stores. Look at how the liquor stores were so busy right when lockdowns started. Is this a coincidence? Maybe not. Maybe it is the case that people, when they don't have these social connections, which do create a lot of positive feelings, they turn to other things to get those positive feelings. And this, I don't think, is a coincidence at all. And research does show in the monkeys that when they were isolated, they were more willing to self-administer cocaine. Molecular imaging evidence shows that changing from social deprivation to an environment with constant social stimulation causes neural remodeling in the dopaminergic neurotransmitter pathways in non-human primates. And this may be clinically relevant for substance abuse disorders in humans. So this is just to say that you can be rehabilitated through social connections. So even though the isolated monkeys were more likely to self-administer cocaine, going from that social deprivation to an environment with more social stimulation did cause that remodeling of the dopamine receptors in the brain. So this made them less likely to want to self-administer cocaine, because now they're getting more dopamine without the drugs. So this kind of provides an insight for rehabilitation in humans. For example, if you can be rehabilitated through social connections. If you are an outcast, and say there is an individual who is addicted to drugs and they are on their own, and maybe they are administering those drugs because they don't have any other ways to feel pleasure. Well, if you reintegrate those people and you really focus on creating a group for those people, and lots of foundations do this, but if this could maybe be more widespread in society, where we really look at these individuals and try to reintegrate them and create social connections, maybe with other individuals who have faced similar problems, then this changes their brain for the better. And this reorganizes their brain. It refreshes their dopamine receptors, like we saw in the monkeys that were reintegrated. So this is how research provides these insights for how we can change society for the better. Let's talk about DNA, the influence social isolation has on DNA. We talked about some of these things in the epigenetics episode, where your DNA can be modulated based on things that happen in the environment. Growing up in an orphanage has been shown to exacerbate the decay of telomeres in cell nuclei. So growing up in an orphanage, the idea is that there aren't enough social connections. There's perhaps more isolation. There's not enough social stimulation. There's not enough care. And this may not be only social isolation that is causing these issues in these orphaned kids, but it could be one of the factors that's happening in an orphanage. Telomeres. So what's so bad about telomere decay? Well, telomeres are basically protection caps that normally prevent chromosome deterioration. So without your telomeres, your chromosomes are going to deteriorate. And your chromosomes, if they deteriorate, that's like, it was put in this article, like the cellular sand clock of aging. So once your chromosomes deteriorate, there's nothing you can do. Your life is lost. Chromosomes hold DNA, the code for life. When you lose the code for life, you're not going to be alive anymore. So if your telomeres are shortening, you can't protect your chromosomes. Telomere shortening has major consequences for various biological pathways and health outcomes. So in longevity research, this is really what you see. You see researchers trying to slow down or even stop telomere deterioration. Because if you can stop that, your chromosomes are not going to deteriorate at all. And people think that they can make people live forever if they find a way to stop the deterioration of telomeres. That's kind of a whole other thing of aging research. And there's a book, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have To, kind of a suggestive title by David Sinclair. He's a researcher who does work on this. And but yeah, we're kind of getting sidetracked. But either way, the point is that social isolation and related things can mess with your DNA itself, the code for your own life. So there are a lot of, unfortunately, negative consequences of this. Let's finish off with just a few things here, more to do with kind of the mind and what's happening there. So let's talk about what's happening with cognitive function. So you're thinking during social isolation. So one 2013 study measured cognitive function at 2 time points in a cohort of more than 6,000 older individuals. People who reported having fewer social contacts and activities at the beginning of the study showed greater decline in cognitive function as measured by verbal fluency and memory recall tasks. So I've talked to people who have kind of been, and I've experienced this too, where it almost seems like not that you're losing your mind, but that you're not as sharp. You can't remember things as well. And we kind of just write it off and say, it's weird times. That must be why. But yes, that maybe is why. And all this isolation, it does mess with how sharp you are and things like this. It's a very weird time. And these studies are showing that your thinking capacity is changing. More recent studies have added weight to this association of people who report fewer social contacts have a decline in cognitive function. So a 2019 study of more than 11,000 people found that individuals who reported higher than average social isolation experienced above average decline in memory function within 2 years of being surveyed. So this could be exactly what's happening when you feel like you're not as sharp, you can't remember that thing that you don't have a memory in a situation where you maybe would have had if we weren't in this pandemic and we weren't isolated and we weren't in these weird times. Well, yes, maybe it is because of social isolation. Let's talk about when we're perceiving people as well wearing masks, and when their facial expression is hidden. So I don't know if you guys feel this way as well, but it is kind of odd interacting with people when their face is hidden behind a mask, because a smile, it does really speak a lot, and it does kind of create a bond with you and whoever you're smiling with. And when you can't see that, it is difficult to interact with them and to have positive interaction, because a smile is almost like a sign of positive interaction. And research does show this. Faces offer a plethora of social information about the emotional expressions of an individual and potentially about their intentions and mental state. And all of these things influence the strength and the bond between two individuals. So when you can't see their smile, this isn't, I guess, fully related to social isolation, but kind of just with the masks and so on. It's when you can't see people smile, it is difficult because you can't form that close bond like research is showing. So that is very difficult. As well, what I've found and what we've kind of touched on in this episode is hypersensitivity to threat. So notice how when you, kind of as I mentioned, like when you go to a crowded place, you feel like there are more threats around you almost. If you bump into someone, I was in the grocery store and I was just walking, like I was going through the aisle and I got to the end of the aisle and I basically just almost T-boned someone with my cart in a way, but it wasn't quite, like she almost like bumped into the left side of me. And you just feel so jumpy when you get that close to someone now. And we both like kind of jumped, and perhaps it was because it was like a sudden encounter, and maybe we would have both been a bit jumpy even if we weren't in these times. But the very fact that you don't get that close to people makes you a little bit more almost aware. You feel like more threatened in a way. And this is what research does show. Research shows that social isolation makes you feel this way. Prolonged social isolation leads to a broad array of behavioral changes in mice. And these induce increased aggressiveness towards unfamiliar mice, persistent fear, and hypersensitivity to threatening stimuli. For example, when encountering a threatening stimulus, mice who have been socially isolated remain frozen in place long after the threat has passed, whereas normal mice stop freezing as soon as the threat is removed. So this is I was kind of like that mouse in the store when I bumped into the lady, and we were both kind of like the mice who had been socially isolated for so long. And we both kind of like froze in fear, like for I guess not for no reason, but we both kind of froze for so long. Whereas if we weren't in the situation, we would have maybe laughed it off or something. Now our eyes both became wide, and we were like, we said sorry and whatnot, but it wasn't this, we couldn't laugh it off like maybe we could before. And this is perhaps due to this increased threat perception due to all of this social isolation. Let's finish it off with the virtual versus in-person connection, and if virtual connecting like over Zoom and over Skype and FaceTime is just as good as face-to-face interaction. There actually isn't much research on this. I did find one small thing though, that studies have revealed that different methods of contact are not equal in reducing feelings of loneliness and depression. So studies found a higher risk of depression in individuals with less than once a month face-to-face contact with children, family, or friends. And people with once or twice a week contact showed to have the lowest rates of depression. So, but they did not find this when it was twice a week contact over the screen, only in person. So there may be something to this in-person connection that we can't quite replicate over the screen. Now, it has been shown though that interventions relying on technology to reduce isolation are better than no intervention at all. So if you can't see your friends, it is worth it to do the Zoom meeting, see your friends. Because it is better than not seeing their face at all, but it doesn't seem to be that it doesn't have quite the same effect as in-person interaction. The question really becomes, you guys, are we ever going to get back to the way things were? Are we ever going to be the same? And I don't know. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this episode. I didn't really want to discuss issues to do with the pandemic. I haven't yet. But you know what? Some of these things, that's the way this podcast has been operating since day one. Whatever strikes me during the week, that's what I work on over the weekend and produce the episode, whatever interests me. And this has been weighing on me. And I met some new people, but I couldn't even see them smile, and they couldn't see me smile when I was meeting them. And that was hard on me. And it just, I think it's been hard on everyone, and it's weighing on everyone. So I thought it was important to touch on it today. I hope you guys, I guess you guys are listening now, and you're still listening. So I guess you guys found it interesting enough as well. And if it's been weighing on you guys, then I feel you. We're all going through it all around the world. Listeners all around the world. We're all experiencing it differently, but hopefully things will be the same again one day. And hopefully these things don't have permanent impacts on the way we interact with people. I'm sure it will persist for quite a while, though. After, our threat perceptions may still be increased, and we may be a little uncomfortable around people at first, I think, but I think over time, kind of like the research shows with over time, the dopamine receptors, they'll recover, and our brains will recover, and our behavioral patterns will hopefully recover too, you guys. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. You guys are the best. I'm going from topic to topic all over the place. Every week is a totally different thing, and there are still consistent listeners who tune in, and I don't know why, but I just thank you guys, because I like doing it, and I've always said I'm just going to keep doing it regardless of whether we have listeners. But just the fact that we do is I am very grateful for that. There's so many things to be grateful for, but that is definitely one of them, you guys. If you did like this episode, just know we're growing our community through word of mouth, as I always say. So just share it with one or two people who are also maybe you've talked about, who are being impacted by all of these issues right now with all the isolation. I know I can't wait to see my friends again in person. Please subscribe or follow and leave a star rating or review on Apple Podcasts, or a like on YouTube. Please share your ideas through the YouTube comments section, the Connect page on the website, or through social media. Check out the blog posts on the website. And for show notes and for access to our monthly ITP video conference call, you can support the podcast on Patreon. Whatever you guys do to support, listening and watching is always plenty. Thank you guys a million for listening to the Insightful Thinkers podcast. We'll be back on Monday as always, and hopefully not so late next Monday, for more in-depth analysis into a diverse set of topics. Take care, everybody.